What's up? Welcome to Weekends with Kasparian and Nando Vila. You love that song more than anyone, Nando. I mean, I love it, but you're always like grooving and moving to it.
That little piano.
Yeah,
it's good.
It's a lot of fun. We've got, I mean, as always, a great show ahead for you guys. Later, we're going to be talking to Seth Ackerman about why Biden's infrastructure proposal is not anything close to the New Deal, although liberal Democrats would make you think so. And I'm going to also talk about Biden's infrastructure bill from a different angle, and that's the framing that we're now seeing from corporatists to essentially try to destroy some of the more beefy provisions in it. And then, Nando, you're always coming correct with the foreign policy.
Yeah, I think I don't know, maybe the people can chime in on the chat, but I think the people like when I take a tour around the world, maybe do some foreign policy talk. I mean, I think they're bored of the U.S. news. They want foreign news.
People are saying, you know,
very many people. I don't know.
Yeah, so it'll be great. So we'll get to all of that in just a minute. But I do have a quick item I'd like to discuss for banter today. And it has to do with the story that was published by Politico. In fact, Politico makes a lot of appearances on the show today, not for good reasons. But there was something published about Representative Ocasio-Cortez donating about $5,000 to dozens of vulnerable Democrats in some of these like purple states. You know, these are Democrats who got elected in 2018, and they're considered vulnerable because they might have flipped the seat in that district, but they're very concerned that Republican attacks will destroy their chances in getting reelected. So Politico reports that, AOC hands over, surprisingly, like without any real notice, $5,000 per Democrat, vulnerable Democrat, without going through the DCCC, which AOC, has publicly had issues with. And these Democrats are like panicking over it because they're like, oh my God, the Republicans are going to attack us if they see that AOC gave us money. And so they're trying to find ways to like reject it. They're trying to find ways to figure out how this happened. They're like, why didn't she just hide the fact that she wanted to donate to us by giving to the DCCC and then they would give us the money? Like, they're so incredibly pathetic.
So I did not see the story when it broke. So I'm learning about it.
Okay.
Today.
Let me give you more details.
$5,000? That's nothing.
That's it.
Right?
That's it. Just $5,000. But like the point of this, look, obviously this whole system of campaign finance is an issue, but that's not the reason why I'm bringing this up. I'm bringing this up because it perfectly highlights the issue with the Democratic Party and how they're constantly terrified of things that they shouldn't be terrified by. So as, the Politico reported, so AOC's like contributions and an oversight at the campaign headquarters has instead raised awkward questions among her colleagues as some swing district Democrats fret over whether to return her money before the GOP can turn it into an attack ad. I got news for you guys. The GOP is going to attack you regardless. It doesn't matter if AOC gives you money or not. At least 3 Democrats have so far either declined the initial transfer or said they would return the money. Representatives Connor Lamb of Pennsylvania, Carolyn Perdue of Georgia, and Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan. And one Democratic consultant who should never be employed ever again says this: the GOP has spent 4 years saying the frontliners are all socialists. Now they've got the receipts to prove it. Anyone telling themselves this won't be in campaign ads is in denial.
So
they're gonna.
So this is. So $5,000. I mean, that's like.
That's it.
These campaigns. I mean, it's nothing. But I mean, I think that the interesting thing about this story is that The DCCC is a organization that is just one of the most effective instruments for the Democratic Party establishment to discipline its members. It's just, you know, they and to essentially punish primary challengers, right? They'll flood they'll flood the coffers of any Democrat that is getting a primary from the left. They'll also pick and choose winners in like they'll influence whether some candidate or another gets money to challenge a Republican. Like, they're just a huge instrument of power. So I think that AOC trying to, in a way, create a separate power node because of her fundraising ability is kind of like an interesting thing in and of itself. Like, whether Republicans are going to, attack these Democrats for that is to be beside the point. I mean, like you said, Republicans attack Democrats for being socialists for whatever. And $5,000 in the grand scheme of things is not a huge amount of money, but something that, our guest today, Seth Ackerman, talks and a lot about is, he wrote a very famous piece in Jacobin called Blueprint for New Parties, that you need to create these kind of outside power nodes. And one of the things that's most important is funding. So it is quite interesting if there were to be some sort of model for the left, broadly speaking, to be able to disperse money to candidates it likes, as a mean to challenge the power of organizations like the DCCC.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually makes a lot of sense. And I don't know if that's what AOC is intentionally engaging in. I know that AOC certainly has problems with the DCCC because after 2018, the DCCC said that it would blacklist anyone who helps a Democratic primary challenger, right? And so they have not been friendly to AOC or the Justice Democrats, which is part of the reason why she made the decision to avoid going through the DCCC and just donate directly to these vulnerable Democrats. And be clear that these Democrats are certainly nowhere near, what we would want in terms of, people who are going to fight for champion socialist or progressive policy proposals. So there's also like that element of AOC, like, she gets a lot of crap for dividing the Democratic Party, for publicly saying things that divide the Democratic Party. But, behind the scenes, she's actually going out of her way to provide some funding for vulnerable Democrats who are not aligned with her ideology, at all. And it's interesting to see how this is playing out, because for everything that we hear from establishment Democrats regarding the need for unity, it's very clear that there are many, Democrats coming from these like moderate states or purple states who just, they don't care about unity. In fact, they're so terrified about being attacked for being associated with AOC that they'll gladly divide the party if it'll benefit their own election outcome.
Unity goes in one direction. If a left,
exactly,
if someone held up some important bill from the left, they would. I mean, just the entire onslaught of the power structure would be overwhelming. Like if Bernie, for example, were the swing vote, or the final vote on some bill that had 49 Democrats, and it was like awful for some reason, and Bernie just like held out and killed the bill by withholding a single vote, the fury, the sound and the fury would be deafening. It would be just absolutely totally unified. Every politician would go insane. The media would back them up on everything. But like, obviously when Sinema or Manchin or whomever else, Warner, whoever else holds up an important bill from the right, that's kid gloves, just like, well, we can't piss them off too much. We can't do with it. Like we have to give the concessions, the thing. So the unity argument has always been bullshit and cynical, and it only goes in one direction.
Exactly. So just wanted to share that little bit with you guys before we get to the bulk of our show. But before we do that, Nando, as always, I want to hear what's up with Verso.
Yes, of course. Well, it's a new month. And that means that you can join the Verso Book Club and get every new ebook that Verso publishes each month, as well as one or more books in the mail. All Verso Book Club members will also get 50% off everything on the website, books and merch, for as long as you are a subscriber. Each member tier is 50% off for your first 3 months. The Conrad tier is only $20 a month, and if you join in April, you'll get 4 books. Planet on Fire, a manifesto for the age of environmental breakdown by Matthew Lawrence, brother of Joy Lawrence, and Laurie Leyburn Langton. Triple alliteration there. Then we got Terminal Boredom by Izumi Suzuki, a short story collection translated from Japanese. Prophets of Deceit, a study of the techniques of the American agitator by Norbert Guterman and Leo Lowenthal. And then the updated paperback edition of Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life by Natasha Leonard. Cool.
I love it. Very cool. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm not really doing much of a decode today. I wanted to have more of a discussion with you, Nando, about Biden's infrastructure bill. So let me present some of what I'm seeing lately. And then I want to get your thoughts, because there's a growing narrative regarding the necessity or the lack of necessity for a more robust infrastructure bill. Now, to be clear, there are huge flaws with the infrastructure bill, which we will get into when we have a discussion with Seth Ackerman later. But for now, I want to talk about what the plan of attack is from both the corporate media and from corporatists overall. And this narrative just really became apparent recently. So the new jobs report indicates that the economy added nearly 1 million new jobs last month in March. So the exact number is 916,000, which was the largest job gain since August. And so you see all the celebratory reports, but unfortunately, some are using these new jobs numbers to argue that, hey, maybe we don't need Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure bill, especially since his selling point is that it would create new jobs. Do we really need this help in creating new jobs when we see that the economy is already doing really well? Now, let me give you the details on where the economy is at right now, but more importantly, also give you the reality of where the economy was at pre-pandemic. Now, the unemployment rate dropped from 2.6% to 6% in February. Unemployment among African Americans and Latinos remained elevated at 9.6% and 7.9% respectively. And the gap with whites narrowed in March. Unemployment among Asian Americans rose to 6% from 5.1% in February. So clearly the unemployment rate did improve with some groups, but unfortunately it became worse with other groups. But you know, the way that the jobs report is reported on, usually it doesn't really give you much of a nuanced look at what type of jobs these are. Are they full-time jobs? Are these people who are going to be underemployed? That's an important thing to keep in mind as we keep getting more and more of this data. Now, again, the jobs report, as unnuanced as it is, was better than most economists expected. And, you know, they did celebrate this. The unemployment rate, though, before the pandemic hit was 3.5%. And so for anyone who's trying to sell this as a pre-coronavirus pandemic recovery is just flat out lying to you, because if you look at the unemployment rate now, it's at 6%. Right. And if you look at this fun graph put together by NPR with data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you'll see that in February of 2020, the unemployment rate was at 3.5%. At the height of the economic collapse related to the pandemic, it was 14.7%. And right now we're at 6%. But again, I need to reiterate that jobs numbers or the unemployment numbers are really, really deceptive when you consider the unemployment question. And we'll get into that in a little more detail in just a minute. Now, there are still 8.4 million fewer payroll jobs in the United States now than there were before the coronavirus took hold a year ago. So clearly, we have not experienced a full recovery. But the media is framing things in interesting ways when considering Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure proposal, which, of course, we learned the details of this week. So here's how it was framed on CNN.
Economists are forecasting continued growth, even a boom going into the summer. And I wonder if the economy is set to boom, why the need to inject another $2 trillion in via this large infrastructure proposal?
Well, thank you, Jim. Yes, these were encouraging numbers. It suggests that the speed with which we have accelerated the vaccination rollout and getting shots into arms, and just the confident economic structure that the Biden administration has put in place has really provided the confidence that the economy needs to start to get going again. But we still have more work to do.
So I kept her answer in there just to give her an opportunity to answer the question. But really, at the heart of what I want you to focus on was just the framing of that question. Well, it looks like the economy is improving, so why would we need an infrastructure bill? Everything was great before the coronavirus pandemic, so why would we need an infrastructure bill? That's really the growing narrative that you're likely to notice if you're paying any attention to corporate media. Let's move over to Politico, which had this headline recently: Biden's spending plans collide with a resurgent U.S. economy. And of course, the subheadline: the numbers signal the United States is well on its way toward revival, one that's widely expected to reach record levels of growth later this year. So again, the message that's being implied there is, why would we need to spend $2 trillion on infrastructure? Why would we need to create government jobs when the economy is doing great? It's booming. It's roaring back. Everything is fine. Just to read a little from the piece that Politico put out, they write that President Joe Biden is pitching his $2 trillion infrastructure proposal as the largest American jobs investment since World War II, a plan that will put millions of people back to work as the country emerges from the coronavirus crisis. The economy, meanwhile, is showing signs of recovering on its own. On its own, guys. What are we doing? What is Biden doing? Further, they write that pitching trillions more in spending as necessary to bring back jobs could become a harder argument to make as the economy looks poised to get there on its own. And I want to be clear that this is not an op-ed in Politico. This is supposedly a straight news story with no opinion injected, which is hilarious. We're also hearing more about the need to target the spending, which you should also keep in mind, because targeting usually means pushing for programs or provisions that are not universal, that are not permanent. And so for anyone who claims that Biden's proposal is, similar to the New Deal is honestly delusional. But more importantly, if you do in the future, especially in the second half of the proposal that hasn't come out yet, have programs that are universal and are permanent, well, this is the kind of talking point that you're likely to hear. So Representative Kevin Brady said this: spending at a much smaller level, but better targeted, would have better bang for the buck. We're wasting far too much of these dollars in areas that frankly aren't related to the recovery. So Nando, I want to bring you in because there is this, as oftentimes we see with capitalists, this conflict in what their interests are. On one hand, you have this need to cut taxes, right? That's really at the heart of the argument here. They're not saying it outright, but they don't want tax increases to pay for this program. At the same time, though, if you care about commerce and if you want to protect the system of capitalism, how do you do that with a crumbling infrastructure, right? So obviously there's a giant conflict there. And it's, again, I'm not talking about this as if Biden's proposal is fantastic. We're going to talk about its flaws when we have Seth Ackerman on. But to attack this as something that's completely unnecessary, I think is delusional.
Yeah, I mean, it's the argument you're seeing from the business class. I was looking at the response from some of the trade groups and things like that. Is that we like the infrastructure spending in theory. We like it. We need better roads, bridges, all that stuff. Airports could be better. Everything that is in that bill we want and could use. The problem is that we don't want the corporate tax increase. We just don't want increases on our taxes to pay for it. And then it's like, well, then how do you pay for it? And what they say, and this is what like everyone made fun of Pete Buttigieg for, is that you do kind of these like usage taxes. The people who benefit from these infrastructure things should be the ones that pay for it. Like you do like some sort of gas mileage tax or, toll booths and things like that. A regressive tax that falls on on regular people. This is what, that Pete Buttigieg thing that came out, was it like this week or the week before, where he was like, yeah, I actually support this, blah, 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 blah. And everyone like laughed at him because, he's just the biggest nerd in the world. But yeah, that's what it is. It's like they want the benefits. They want the benefits of the state to protect their business interests, to help, smooth the flows of commerce from one side to the other, but they don't want to pay for it. They want other people to pay for it, meaning us, regular people.
And really, that's been the play for quite some time now, right? Public investment in what these like executives and what these businesses get to take advantage of, right? A lot of public investment, especially in research and development, which all of a sudden you're seeing people like Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, come out and be like, oh, there's funding here for research and development. Yeah, the taxpayer actually pays for the research and development for a lot of private companies, including pharmaceutical companies, because private investors don't want to take on that risk. We as US taxpayers tend to take on that risk. And then oftentimes, especially with pharmaceutical companies, they'll turn around and price gouge us. So that's how this system has been functioning. So, you have the corporate is coming out and basically saying, without saying it explicitly, why don't we just keep doing what we've been doing? Like, why don't we just have ordinary Americans pay for what we're going to take advantage of, and what we need in order to ensure that business continues to run smoothly. But the other thing I wanted to bring up is just this notion that all we need to do is get back to the pre-pandemic economy, as if the pre-pandemic economy was fantastic. And we all know, that just wasn't the case. Prior to the pandemic, the vast majority of Americans were in an incredibly precarious situation. Insane student loan debt, of course. The Federal Reserve put out that study showing that nearly 50% of Americans couldn't afford a $400 emergency. That wasn't during COVID. That was before COVID. Revolving debt, for instance, which is mostly made up of credit card debt, reached a high of $1.1 trillion. Which means that people aren't able to make do with their wages and have to charge things that they need on credit cards. I mean, the economy prior to the pandemic was a disaster. And the fact that you have people with a serious face making this point on national television or writing this up in Politico and other publications is just absolutely ridiculous. And either shows a complete disconnect from the very people that they're actually trying to write about, or more importantly, a disconnect between, or more importantly, they just intentionally are being deceptive in their reporting here.
Yeah.
But obviously, this infrastructure bill is necessary, but we want something a little more comprehensive, something bolder that actually responds to the crisis of the moment. And that crisis isn't just about the coronavirus pandemic.
No, and it's interesting, the media, like as you pointed out, just how ingrained a lot of this like the zombie ideology is. Like, they can't fathom the possibility that the government, the state, can stimulate economic activity. That's just like economic activity is a thing that happens in kind of the natural world, and the state is only a thing that can potentially hinder that natural state of things. That is not that's deeply ingrained in the media. That's taken as absolute fact. And so it's eventually something has eventually then we have to just like get past this, that this is just kind of the natural order of things. I mean, it's just, that's what we've been conditioned to believe in the last 30 or 40 years, that the economy is something separate from the state. The state can only potentially hinder that.
I mean, that's certainly the talking point. But when you look at the policies and like how, like, again, public money helps to support private industry, you'll see that that's really never been the case. And I do want to also share some sound with you guys, starting with the Fox News narrative. I mentioned Kristi Noem. She also tried to lie to the American people about who would be impacted by tax increases. So let's take a look at that and debunk it real quick.
Insanely high state and local taxes will become your new normal no matter where you live. Here with reaction, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem. Governor, is my analysis correct that in spite of saying that only the rich are going to pay and these evil corporations pay, I argue this will be paid for by the average American person. Doesn't matter how much you make.
That's right. You're exactly right, Sean. Every single family will pay the price for what Joe Biden's agenda is. He will drive up the cost of the food and their grocery bill. He will drive up the cost of their utilities, their gas prices, the cost of their cars, the clothes they dress their children in. Everything that they do each and every day will be more expensive. Their budgets will be tighter because they'll be earning less, and it'll be directly because of these policies and these tax increases that Joe Biden is embracing and pushing through Congress.
So none of that is going to happen. Biden calls for a corporate tax increase. Honestly, not even enough of a corporate tax increase because he's going from 21% to 28%. Prior to Trump's tax cuts for the rich, the corporate tax rate was 35%. And when it comes to raising taxes on individuals, if you're making anything under $400,000, you will not be touched by the tax increases. At least how the proposal is put out at the moment. But it's hilarious because they're worried about their tax increases. They're worried about corporate tax increases. And to fearmonger about this as if it's going to increase the price of food and clothing for children specifically, not for adults. Adult clothing will remain the same. Clothing for your children, though, that will go up in price somehow. Yeah. It's just so stupid. It's beyond stupid that people buy into these arguments and these narratives, but they're already going out there full force. And unfortunately, Joe Biden seems ready and willing to cave to the demands of people who are looking out for corporate interests. He says debate is welcome, compromise is inevitable, changes in my plan are certain, but inaction is not an option. Not good. Not a good place to start.
Very not good. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to think really about the prospects of this bill. I mean, in theory, we do need a massive trillions dollar infrastructure bill. We absolutely need that. The size of it is going to be a huge indicator. I mean, I saw that Larry Summers came out and said that the Joe Biden's plan looked about right to him. Remember, Larry Summers was hyperventilating over the coronavirus, the size of the coronavirus relief bill. And he was instrumental in negotiating downward Obama's response to the financial crisis. So if Larry Summers is happy with the size of this infrastructure bill, it's a good indication that it's probably not big enough. That you could probably go twice as big and, get it to the point where Larry Summers is like hyperventilating, and that's probably the correct size of the infrastructure bill.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And, I just lost my train of thought. There was one other thing I wanted to bring up. But yeah, I mean, we'll see how this all plays out. But on one hand, you have corporate interests who are trying to fight this as if it is the New Deal, and it's not. And then on the Democrat side, you have this talking point about how this is going to save the country. This is all we need. This is the answer we've been looking for. But it certainly does not go far enough in providing the funding necessary to shift over to green energy. And that's why climate activists have, pretty much criticized that component of it, while giving Biden credit for at least being a little more focused on climate change. And I also wanted to mention, we had been giving him some credit for moving away from the deficit hawk nonsense. And it seems like this proposal is moving back in the direction of freaking out or panicking about the deficit. And that worries me.
The interesting change politically to me, I mean, I do think that obviously the deficit concerns are going to come out again. They don't have the same level of oomph that they used to. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing politically for me is that they do use some rhetorical gestures towards this, but there is no hope that there's going to be any bipartisan participation in this bill. I mean, they might say a couple things like kind of at the outset, but that was very much central to the Obama strategy, was like, we need to get Republicans no matter what. Like, we need to peel off a few of them just to say we did. And I think that has broken a little bit, even amongst like kind of awful, annoying Democrats, that they don't have any hope for Republicans getting on board. I mean, I'm seeing the reaction to John Boehner's memoir or whatever the hell he just published. People are like, see, they never really wanted to. And like, it's annoying because we knew that at the time, but it just contributes more to this idea that the Republicans are just they're not people that you can hope to peel off by, appealing to the better angels of their nature, or by giving them a few concessions here and there, that you're just negotiating against yourself at that point. So, if Biden does really commit to that strategy of not really caring if any Republicans get on board, then you start to see the seeds of some sort of change politically in the United States.
Yeah. We'll revisit this topic during our interview segment, but for now, why don't we take a break from Biden's infrastructure bill and talk a little bit about foreign policy?
Oh, yes. Yes, Hannah, because, Bolivia, our old friend, is back in the news. And we've covered Bolivia extensively on this show, but in case you need a quick recap, back in October of 2019, Bolivia held an election in which Evo Morales, Bolivia's first ever indigenous president and a titan of the left-wing pink tide movement in Latin America, won pretty handily. However, the OAS claimed that there were irregularities in the vote. The U.S. agreed, of course, and the Bolivian military stepped in to remove Morales from power, and a woman named Janine Áñez assumed the presidency. Áñez was a little-known far-right politician at the time who did not run in the election, but after the military's intervention, she was now the president. She then proceeded to lead a brutal repression of Morales' supporters, which led to several dozen deaths, and took legal steps to bar leaders of Morales' party from running.
While in power, Áñez was accused of siding with security forces to shut down dissent.
She came to power undemocratically, and within her first week, she oversaw 2 different massacres and offered immunity to the soldiers that carried out the massacres, and for the next year carried out a slew of human rights abuses.
Yeah, it's your classic right-wing military coup. And then the Bolivian people, through their large trade union movement, resisted the coup, called a series of general strikes, and forced Áñez to hold new elections, which she promptly lost. And Luis Arce, a former Morales deputy, won and is now the president. Naturally, the new government wants justice for the perpetrators of the violent coup, and they arrested Janine Áñez for her role in it.
4 months ago, Janine Áñez was president of Bolivia. Now she's under arrest, accused of staging a coup against her predecessor, Evo Morales. Shortly after being detained in the city of Trinidad, she was flown to the capital, La Paz, to face charges of terrorism, sedition, and conspiracy.
Now, this seems pretty straightforward. You do a right-wing coup, you incite violence, you kill a bunch of people, and then you face justice for it. But not to the U.S. government and their mouthpieces in the press. Shortly after the news of Áñez's arrest came out, Joe Biden's new Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, tweeted this, quote, "We are deeply concerned by growing signs of anti-democratic behavior and politicization of the legal system in Bolivia. The Bolivian government should release detained former officials pending an independent and transparent inquiry into human rights and due process concerns." This came shortly after a stunning Washington Post editorial that said, quote, "Mr. Arce had pledged to govern on the basis of unity and conciliation. Thus did Bolivia appear to exit a crisis that the leader of Mr. Arce's party, former President Evo Morales, precipitated by attempting to steal a 4th term through election fraud in 2019, leading to often violent demonstrations, the military's abandonment of the Morales-led government, nice euphemism there, and Mr. Morales' departure to exile." I say stunning, not because I don't think that the Washington Post editorial page is a mouthpiece for the U.S. State Department, which it is, but stunning because it was the Washington Post itself that first questioned the OAS narrative in the U.S. media that Evo Morales stole that election in 2019. In February of 2020, 5 months after the election and subsequent coup, The Washington posted an independent analysis of the election numbers and the OAS report. They concluded, quote, "Our results were straightforward. There does not seem to be a statistically significant difference in the margin before and after the halt of the preliminary vote. Instead, it is highly likely that Morales surpassed the 10 percentage point margin in the first round." So yeah, you don't get a better example of the US media being used as an instrument for state power. The journalists say one thing, the op-ed writers say another. But it also shows a stunning double standard. Here's that WAPO editorial again. Quote, "Now, unfortunately, Mr. Arce appears to have reverted to a more one-sided and vengeful leadership style characteristic of Mr. Morales, who's returned to Bolivia and still wields considerable power." Ooh. On March 13th, the government jailed Ms. Añez and 2 former members of her cabinet, threatening them with persecution and long-term prison terms. Warrants are out for several other former top officials. These actions follow an amnesty for Mr. Morales' supporters accused of human rights violations while Mrs. Añez was in power, as well as the institution of de facto political loyalty tests for key government employees. Oh, yeah, I like my ministers to, agree with me politically. I don't need a team of rivals. Now, when Janine Añez took power, she did the exact same thing that the Washington Post is accusing Luis Arce of doing.
Just a month ago, Evo Morales was Bolivia's head of state. He was forced out after being accused of rigging a presidential election. Now he's in exile in Argentina, and Bolivian police have formally accused him of promoting clashes between law enforcement and his supporters. On Twitter, Interior Minister Arturo Murillo taunted him with a picture of his arrest warrant. And Morales' successor, interim President Janine Añez, has previously said if he returns to Bolivia, he would have to face trial.
If he wants to return to Bolivia, he knows he has to give answers to the country and he has to account for himself before the justice system and face the consequences.
Now, this assessment also was written in the pages of the Washington Post. They wrote, quote, "The military-installed government charged Morales with sedition and terrorism. A European Union monitoring report noted that some 40 former electoral officials have been arrested and face criminal charges of sedition and subversion, and 35 people have died in the post-electoral conflict." But the Washington Post editorial page said nothing then, not a peep, no concern for democracy or human rights or due process in Bolivia when it was a right-wing coup government attacking the left. So what is going on here? Well, you would have thought that the new Biden administration would want to distance itself from Trump's foreign policy. But that's not really how U.S. foreign policy works. It is remarkably consistent no matter who is in power at any given moment. Let's go back to the new Secretary of State's Twitter feed. On April Fool's Day, he tweeted, quote, "It's about holding up the international rules-based system that all of us have invested so much into over the last 75 years, and it has served our interests and our values very well." And of course, that tweet is laughable for those of us on the left, but Blinken was being honest. The US, in many ways, created the so-called international rules-based system. Here's according to a piece in The Nation from 2015. The US is a country that, more than any other, nurtured the idea and wrote the rules for an international community of nations governed by the rule of law. At the first Hague Peace Conference in 1899, the U.S. delegate Andrew Dixon White, the founder of Cornell University, pushed for the creation of a permanent court of arbitration and persuaded Andrew Carnegie to build the monumental Peace Palace at The Hague as its home. At the Second Hague Conference in 1907, the Secretary of State Elihu Root urged that future international conflicts be resolved by a court of professional jurists, an idea first realized when the Permanent Court of International Justice was established in 1920. After World War II, the U.S. used its triumph to help create the United Nations, push for the adoption of its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and ratify the Geneva Conventions for humanitarian treatment in war. If you throw in other American-backed initiatives like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank, you pretty much have the entire infrastructure of what we now casually call the international community. The thing is, the United States really pushed to create all that, and then proceeded to immediately ignore it. The official U.S. policy for 75 years has been international rules-based system for thee, but not for me. And as Blinken said on that April Fool's tweet, It has served the U.S. very well. Perhaps the clearest example of this U.S. policy towards is the U.S. policy towards the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court was established in 2002 and was meant to be a tribunal that would bring justice to war criminals. But as soon as it was created, the United States undermined its authority. Quote, once the newly established International Criminal Court, or ICC, convened at The Hague in 2002, the Bush White House unsigned or de-signed the UN agreement creating the court and then mounted a sustained diplomatic effort to immunize U.S. military operations from its writ. This was an extraordinary abdication for the nation that had breathed the concept of an international tribunal into being. And this is still U.S. policy today. It remained throughout the administrations of Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden. Here's Secretary of State Blinken again on his Twitter feed. He wrote, today, POTUS removed sanctions previously imposed against the International Criminal Court personnel. The U.S. maintains our position to the the U.S. maintains our opposition to the ICC's attempts to exercise jurisdiction over personnel of non-states parties, such as the United States and Israel. He then followed up that tweet with, we believe a more effective approach to reform includes engagement to help the ICC achieve its core mission of accountability for atrocity crimes. In other words, we love the International Criminal Court. We're going to reverse the Trump policy of sanctioning the court's personnel. We believe that atrocities and crimes deserve accountability. Just don't dare come for us or Israel. It's really that brazen. They don't even bother to provide some sort of explanation. It's just, we're more powerful, fuck you. Which brings us back to Bolivia. According to Cindy Forster in Jacobin, the woman who launched the criminal lawsuit against the heads of the coup government is Lydia Patty. She filed a case against several figures, among them a key leader of right-wing paramilitary initiatives, Luis Fernando Camacho, the sinister Arturo Murillo, the former head of the police, and Áñez's former minister and personal assistant, Yerko Núñez. An indigenous Quechua woman and elected senator in the mass government, Patty was among those who refused to resign with the coup. On March 15th, Patty spoke on public radio and television networks. There were tortures. Protesters had their fingers cut off. Women in protests were manhandled by the soldiers, their intimate parts groped, just like in colonial times. In the jail cells, our sisters were raped. She spoke of the coup regime's racism towards indigenous and peasant representatives in parliament, where they were told, you are our domestics and go home to your kitchens. When she left office after her term in 2020, Patty chose to file the lawsuit as a private citizen against Áñez. Contrast this with the United States, who is condemning the arrest of Áñez and her cronies. According to the words of our Secretary of State, the U.S. is very concerned with the growing anti-democratic behavior and politicization of the legal system in Bolivia. We care about human rights and due process concerns. The United States is concerned with due process. This is coming from the government that jails more of its people than any other nation in the world, that often holds people in jail without trial for several years, that still operates Guantanamo Bay, which still holds 40 prisoners with no hope of ever being given a trial, let alone being released, a nation that carried out torture and still reserves the right to drone bomb anyone, anywhere in the world for any reason at all. I could go on and on. When the United States talks about human rights, it is always, always, always a cynical ploy to discipline countries that don't adhere totally to the United States' will. Most of the time, the crime those countries actually commit is trying to use their wealth to aid their own poor rather than the American capitalist class.
Obviously, everything that you outlined in your segment today is correct. And, it's interesting to see the commentary coming from Democrats about how different Biden's administration is going to be from that of Barack Obama's. But if you really look at foreign policy and how it's not just something that impacts other countries. Foreign policy has a very close tie to what we're experiencing at home with immigration, with militarized police departments across the country. If Biden's unwilling to change the course on U.S. foreign policy, then a lot of the fundamental issues that we have in this country will remain unchanged. As you know, like the funding that we put into the military leads to an insane inventory of weaponry. And then when they have a surplus of that weaponry, it ends up getting sold to local police departments, and that weaponry gets used against us. When it comes to the crisis at the border, that is obviously something that's driven by the type of meddling that you outlined, Nando, like, overthrowing democratically elected leaders, especially in Latin American countries, destabilizing these countries, and then pretending as if we're surprised when we have an influx of migrants seeking asylum in the United States. All of these things are tied together. And, as you talk about the reaction to Áñez getting arrested, I couldn't help but think about, Venezuela and the fact that, Maduro, like, I always wonder, how is it that Maduro just lets Juan Guaido like roam about freely?
Yeah.
Who does that? And maybe it's because he knows what the reaction from the United States would be if he took any action against Guaido. I don't know. But like, for all of the fear mongering we hear about people like Maduro, just again, keep in mind that like Juan Guaido, who has attempted multiple coups in his country, just walks about
not just
freely.
that, calls himself the president and is recognized by several Western governments, including the United States, as the official president of Venezuela. Like
it's amazing.
The U.S. policy, both under Trump and Biden, is that Juan Guaido is the elected leader of Venezuela. That is official U.S. policy. The actual elected leader of Venezuela, Maduro, allows this to just happen in his country. Allows him to just traipse around and give press conferences and things like that. It's just, the supposedly authoritarian, Maduro is just allowing a guy who calls himself the president and is recognized by Western governments as the president to just live his life. It's really quite remarkable.
And whether you're talking about Janine Áñez or Juan Guaido, what stands out is this, sense of entitlement and just how brazen they are. And so when there happens to be consequences for being the, face and the leader of a US-backed coup, there's like shock and awe that there would be any consequences. But, obviously, considering the massacres that took place due to Áñez and that coup, there's going to be consequences. It's shocking that they didn't expect that. And I just wanted to quickly, briefly mention the two things to also look at in regard to foreign policy moving forward. Well, one of the main things I would say is China, because the rhetoric and so far the actions of the Biden administration toward China remain unchanged from what we saw under the Trump administration. And as China continues to accumulate its power, as it unquestionably will become the most powerful country in the world, the United States is going to have its temper tantrum. And that's pretty terrifying because China is not a country that we should be messing with, right? And if anything, if we're serious about doing something about climate control, climate change, you're not going to be able to do that unilaterally. Yes, the United States produces the most CO2 emissions, and obviously our actions matter, but we need to work with other countries, including China, in order to get that situation under control. We can't do it unilaterally. So using, antagonistic rhetoric toward China, I don't think is going to play out well. It's just amazing. On one hand, you have, powerful people in this country saying we don't need to spend money on infrastructure. And then on the other hand, you have all the fear mongering about China and how they're kicking our ass. But we'll talk about that with Seth Ackerman in just a minute. And then Iran. We're not going to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. It's just not going to happen because Biden wants concessions from Iran before even considering rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. But we're the ones who pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. So why would we demand
murdered their guy
and murdered their top general? Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No
so these
deal.
are all things to keep in mind. The Biden administration's foreign policy so far has been pretty terrible. It's just a continuation of what we've been experiencing for decades. And for anyone who thinks that doesn't matter for domestic policy, you're wrong. All of this stuff is intertwined. All of it is related. So why don't we bring on our guest? And that's, of course, Seth Ackerman. who's going to talk to us a little bit about why Joe Biden's infrastructure proposal is not the New Deal, despite all of the exaggerated language we've heard from some Democrats. Seth, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start off with why it is that Biden's proposal is nowhere near what we saw with the New Deal.
Well, I think that the biggest distinction between what Biden is doing and what Roosevelt was doing, or between their approaches, and I think this is probably the most telling aspect of the situation, is what you're hearing or not hearing from business, from the Chamber of Commerce, from the National Association of Manufacturers, or the business world generally. The Republicans, of course, are screaming about this bill and calling it all kinds of names. That's their job. But their business allies are, for one thing, it's important to remember that unlike most of the programs of the New Deal that we remember today, an infrastructure plan more or less along the lines that Biden is proposing has been at the top of the wish list of the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, also of the labor movement too. It's an area of very wide consensus in American politics among American interest groups, and so what you have is a situation where Biden is finally taking the opportunity of the kind of void left by the destruction in Trump's wake politically, to be able to push through something that was always considered to be a kind of political low-hanging fruit, because everybody was for infrastructure, nobody was against infrastructure, and it was just a kind of it was political dysfunction that was keeping it from happening. So this is something that business wanted. That doesn't necessarily make it reactionary, because it also has a lot of things in it that are going to be good for workers, but it all depends on the details, which we don't have yet. Everything that I just said differs pretty markedly from Roosevelt, who famously number one was detested by the National Association of Manufacturers at the time, and he famously said that he welcomed their hatred. That's not at all Biden's approach. Biden, the other day, he said, this isn't socialism. I believe in American capitalism. And, I think that it's important to sort of keep a balanced perspective. On the one hand, this is, I think, a much more aggressive approach to, kind of traditional liberal policy than we saw from Obama. And then at the same time, it's not like the New Deal because of the nature of who's lining up for and against it. Biden is really pushing through the measures that have really some of the broadest support of anything that you could find on the Democratic policy agenda.
Yeah, it's, people don't realize or people don't remember, or it's just not really talked about that much, but the reaction to Roosevelt, I mean, there was something called the business plot, like a literal coup attempt from several business leaders and some members of the military to remove Roosevelt through a military coup and install some sort of fascist government, and it was foibled. You wrote in a Substack piece that I found very provocative and good, where that while a lot of liberals are comparing Biden to FDR and LBJ, and apparently Biden likes that comparison, that the closest historical parallel to the Biden-Schumer-Pelosi plan is the Trump-McConnell-Pelosi COVID package of 2022, also known as the CARES package, that Biden, the man he should compare himself to, is not FDR or LBJ, but rather one Donald J. Trump. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, it's very easy to forget now. Among other things, it's easy to forget anything that happened 6 months ago, because there's been such a fire hose of news over the last few years. But just a year ago, something happened which probably would have been hard for anybody to believe if they'd been told about it, a few years previously, which was that a Republican president signed into law a bill that sent out checks for free to every household, whether they were working or not, plus a lot of other stuff that probably would have been hard to believe a Republican would be supporting. And obviously that was because of an emergency situation. The pandemic was something that was different from anything that we'd experienced before. And but the fact that in that emergency situation, political consensus existed to push through a policy like that. It really, I think, broke down a lot of barriers and taboos that have allowed Biden to kind of push what ultimately is in the end a very similar kind of policy. It's kind of like the CARES Act, only more so. You see a lot of continuity in the sense that Trump was politically incapable of actually doing it, but if there was one real actual policy as opposed to just Twitter theatrics that Trump always was promising that he wanted to do and that he was going to do, but he never did, was infrastructure. And then the one thing that he ended up doing as a big policy measure, other than his tax bill, was a big emergency cash assistance plan. And what you're seeing initially from the Biden administration is a big infrastructure bill and a big cash assistance emergency program. So in that sense, it's continuity. But on the other hand, there is this change in the atmosphere, a change in the set of things that Democratic senators seem to be willing to swallow, that the Democratic policy world seems willing to entertain. And I think it's good to be skeptical of how much those noises are actually going to be realized. But my sense is that something has changed. It's just not clear exactly what it is yet. What it isn't is another New Deal.
Right. And one of the things that stands out to me, at least based on what we know so far, things can change. This is supposedly, the first part of Biden's proposal. The second part will focus on, the child tax credit, for instance, which he was able to pass through the last relief plan. But there's really no talk of anything permanent, right? Because when you talk about a transformative policy, you're talking about something that fundamentally changes how money is redistributed. And in this case, as far as we know, nothing is really permanent here. It's just, when you say continuation, what I think of is, it's another situation where we're throwing money at something, which is good. That's not to minimize the positive provisions included here, but really, there's nothing that's going to be lasting in terms of, a transformative program, making the child tax credits permanent. He might propose that in the second part of his legislation, but I'm also a little concerned about how this is going to be put out, because is this going to be two different bills? And if that's the case, will there be enough political capital to pass both of them? And I'm worried that by decoupling, the child tax credit and all of those other really important programs, what will end up happening is the infrastructure part might pass because of business interests, but the other provisions that I would like to see passed wouldn't actually make it. I don't know, but we have to see how it's going to be proposed. Is it going to be one robust bill or two separate bills?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that that so far Biden's approach has been pretty clearly to entertain ideas, from his campaign policy agenda, which was kind of a copy and paste of recent Democratic Party policy world ideas, and he's been talking up those ideas, but then legislatively he's quite ruthlessly pragmatic, and he's willing to jettison anything. He starts at the bottom of the list in terms of how easy it is to pass a given measure, how much support or how little support a measure has, and he just starts chopping things off until he gets to a level of support that he thinks he can get, or that he thinks that can pass the bill. So at the moment, so in other words, early days of the administration, there was a lot of talk about how Biden was going to be passing, there was going to be a massive childcare program, and there was in the infrastructure bill, there was going to be a $15 minimum wage. In the COVID assistance plan, certainly with the minimum wage, it's not just that Biden in the end got rid of it, but he seemed quite prepared to get rid of it without a lot of fuss. He seemed to be kind of expecting that he would he would end up doing that. So I think that a fair number of these good-sounding policies that are being mooted in the press are probably going to end up being bargaining chips. So that by abandoning one or the other, he can show that he has compromised, and then he can get something passed. Maybe that's something that Joe Manchin needs to see. And he needs a headline that says, Biden has abandoned this or that liberal policy, and then that gives him permission to vote for it, something like that. Yeah.
I want to ask you about this line that has come out in the wake of the COVID relief package, that it cuts child poverty in half. This was something that the liberal commentators were very excited about. In your analysis of the plan, you mentioned that it does achieve some, it does achieve the reduction in poverty for children, but you point out that it's very similar to the amount that was reduced in the Trump CARES package. Can you explain what's going on with this line? What do the numbers say, and what do you make of this kind of, I guess, selling effort that it cuts child poverty in half?
It was a fantastic marketing move, and it was very clearly. I mean, this is not necessarily a bad thing if you want to pass legislation, or if you just want to advertise that you've passed legislation. That's the sort of thing you would do. But basically, on the day of Biden signing the bill, there was a spate of headlines pointing out. I guess the news hook was there was an analysis that was done by a policy institute at Columbia that found that the bill was going to cut child poverty in half in 2021. So, I mean, what poverty means in policy terms, technically, is the number of people who have an income below some threshold. So because the CARES Act is going to be mailing out a lot of checks to people in 2021 in a single year, there's going to be a fair number of people whose incomes are going to go up above that threshold. And so that represents a reduction in the child poverty rate of apparently about 1/2. But if you scroll back through the archives of the same policy institute, actually, and you look at their analysis that they did of the CARES Act, of Trump's bill a year earlier, they also analyzed it to figure out how many people were going to be lifted above the poverty line, and it was basically about the same percentage point reduction in the number of poor people was going to result from the Trump CARES Act. So I think that it was a selling effort. I mean, the fact that that report came out the day that Biden signed the bill, and that he left on a tour to sort of promote it and hype it. It's an indication that this is what they thought was going to be a successful way of selling the bill, or a successful way of ginning up enthusiasm for it. And it's great to reduce child poverty, even if it is just for a year. But you really got, it was very easy to get a misleading impression from, like the headlines or the tweets or whatever, if you weren't paying close attention. And to think that Biden had just signed a bill that was going to cut child poverty in half, in the sense that, when we talk about war on poverty programs or New Deal programs like Social Security, they had lasting, permanent effects in reducing the rate of elderly poverty in the case of Social Security, or child poverty in the case of some of the Great Society programs. Those were reductions in poverty that weren't just 1 year; they were permanent. And that's the impression that you got from a lot of the headlines with Biden's bill. Now, if you talk to the people who were hyping that stuff, they would say that what makes Biden's bill different, or what makes it justified to talk up that aspect of it, is the fact that there is a proposal that Biden has embraced to make the child tax credit permanent. So in other words, this is supposed to be sort of like an appetizer, and the main course is going to be a bill that's going to come later. That's the main meal, which is making the thing permanent, and that actually would be like a Great Society type program. Biden has publicly very firmly embraced the idea of a permanent child tax credit, but since then, he and his team have been going through the numbers and figuring out how this is going to mesh with their infrastructure bill and talking to senators and all the rest of it. And so now you're hearing noises about possibly, for example, having the child benefit be made to continue, but to sunset after 5 years. So that would be right after the next presidential election. So what that means is, if Biden were to lose the election, then that would be the end of the child benefit. On the other hand, you could argue that then is a great motivator at the polls. You can get people to come out to vote for you because you've got this popular policy. But in any case, it's clear from the pattern of Biden's actions, I think, that he has identified the things that have very wide consensus support, and the things that have only the support of the sort of liberals who are the types who have been hyping this like child poverty statistic. And whenever there's any kind of a conflict between the two, he is very ready to get rid of the stuff that only appeals to liberals and to focus on the stuff that has a lot of broad-based support, including from business, Republicans, and so on.
Yeah, and that's something to be concerned about, especially because, there's the child tax credit, which, is popular and should pass. And then there's also, the language coming from the Biden administration in regard to the PRO Act, which has business interests for obvious reasons, panicking about it. And so I came across this exchange on CNBC that I wanted to share with you guys and get your reaction to it, Seth, because it's not just about the PRO Act. It's the tax increases that are proposed as part of this infrastructure bill, in addition to the PRO Act. And just listen to the language here by Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who's from the think tank American Action Forum.
If you look at the composition, if you were to raise the taxes they're raising, the corporate rate, global minimum tax, book income tax, and spend that really, really carefully on core R&D, core infrastructure, you might break even, but I doubt it. If you water it down with the sort of social programs they've got in there, $400 billion expansion of Medicaid, Medicare, and a whole bunch of other things, and then toss in this protecting right to organize PRO Act, which is an extraordinarily anti-growth provision. On balance, this is bad for economic growth, bad for the economy.
Explain that last piece. Why did you say that?
So the PRO Act would preempt right-to-work laws in 27 states. It would change the classification of workers and independent contractors, much like California has with its ABC legislation. It would embrace the joint employer standard that would allow essentially the end of the franchise model in the United States. So it would get rid of the prohibition on secondary boycotts and lead to a lot of very disruption in the flow of goods and services. So there's none of that is about creating jobs or creating greater productivity. So I have real concerns about the economic policy that's in this proposal.
So I wanted to get your reaction to his allegations there, Seth.
Well, I mean, that's, Douglas Holtz-Eakin is sort of like the reality-based economist who works for the Republican Party. There may be one or two other ones. And so it's his job to go on CNBC and badmouth Democratic economic policy generally. I mean, I think it's interesting that even he, there was a piece in the Washington Post the other day by Paul Waldman where he made a point that I thought made a lot of sense, resonated with me, which is that the opposition from the Republicans or Republican world to Biden's infrastructure plan, and also this was the same thing goes for the emergency COVID package. They've been opposing it. Not a single Republican voted for these things or will vote for the infrastructure bill, most likely. And yet there is a notable lack. This is what I was thinking when I saw that clip you just aired. There's a lack of passion and conviction, strangely enough, that is kind of eerie. It's not a lot. It's quite different from what you saw in like the Obama years when the Tea Party was running rampant, and they said all this stuff, but they also seemed to really believe it, and they also seemed to think that they could get other people to believe it too. And this time, there's a kind of diffidence about the opposition. Holtz-Eakin there was, he was saying, well, if you get rid of a few of these parts of the infrastructure bill, you might be able to pay for, you might be able to get more productivity enough sufficiently to pay for the cost of the investment. But then there's all these other social programs that we don't like. It's not exactly a stirring call to, to insurrection against a socialist tyranny. It's what's remarkable to me so far has been how difficult the Republicans have seemed to find it figuring out how to oppose the stuff that Biden's doing. And I think this is related to what I said a bit earlier, which is that Biden's approach has been to zero in laser-like on those aspects of his agenda that have the least opposition, the most broad-based support, and be willing to sort of trim everything else. And I think that it's to the credit of that strategy that, in part, there's other aspects of there's other factors also, but that's part of the reason why you see the Republicans having such a difficult time figuring out how they're going to portray this as the end of civilization as we know it. So if there's one aspect of Biden's administration so far that is a little bit like the New Deal, it's the sense of disarray that you get from the opposition. That's disarray and incoherence. And sort of like a dawning sense of dread that a realization that of just how unpopular they are, or just how few things they have to offer that are popular. So that's that to me is the thing that resembles it, and that's what I was reminded of when I was listening to Holtz-Eakin.
Can I just quickly jump in on that? Because, sorry, Nando. I just want to make a quick point. I think you're right. And I wonder how much of Trump's success in using, populist framing in campaigning has basically pushed Republicans up against a wall. Like they know that messaging resonated with Republican voters and, working class people. And so, it's really difficult to undo that. Because precisely what you mentioned, I mean, they don't really have any other solutions or anything else to offer people. So it's difficult to come out against something that would improve people's lives. I mean, clearly it doesn't go as far as we'd like, but it would improve people's lives considerably from what they're experiencing right now.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to remember that most people don't pay very close attention to politics, and especially not to the policy side of politics. But what they do, and what they really do notice, however little they pay attention, is when the government sends them a check. And so, Trump sent them a check. I say Trump partly because, that's how he wanted it to be portrayed. He wanted everyone to know that this was not just the government, but it was Donald Trump personally who was sending these checks. Everybody knew that. I mean, even the people who have the least knowledge and the least interest in politics at least know that Donald Trump is a Republican and that Donald Trump sent them this check. So the whole Republican approach to policy, which is basically to say the Democrats are bad because they want to send checks to people for nothing, has really hit the skids. I mean, because you're talking about a contradiction that is visible to almost everybody, not just like a small number of people who pay really close attention to politics. So, I mean, remember the Tea Party, which injected so much energy into the Republican, into the Republican Party, was all about, I don't want, at the beginning, especially, it was, I don't want to pay for, my neighbor who took out a mortgage that was too big. I don't want to pay for this. I don't want to pay for that. How do you get the toothpaste back in the tube after that? I mean, I agree with you. I think that's a real problem for them.
Yeah.
Corey Robin always makes the point that the right or conservatism or whatever you want to call it is most energetic when it's kind of in opposition to sort of some hegemonic alternative. I'm like reminded of like toward the end of the 1970s, like the Carter administration, which was kind of like the end of like the New Deal era in a way, like the liberal response to the conservative movement's energy was, like you said, in the case of the business response to the New Deal, and the Republican response now just kind of weak or incoherent or kind of cut off guard. And that seems to me like that's the moment that we're entering in now, where the sort of tenets of the right have been so dominant for so long, and they just don't know, they don't have the energy. They've lost the muscle, so to speak. So what kind of phase are we entering? Because it also is not like some left-wing kind of ascendancy that we would like, but what are we entering?
I mean, it's a good question. I think that the fact that it's so difficult to answer, or even really to have a sense of what the possibilities are, is a testament to how fluid the moment is. And I think this is because 4 years of Trump, and then if you want to go deeper than that, not just 4 years of Trump, but also then the Obama years of where McConnell took Republican obstruction to 100%, so that it became sort of the normal processes of government, in a sense, kind of came to a halt, and whatever governing happened was all sort of like emergency measures, or reconciliation, or and then in the end, not very much. All of those things ended up kind of destroying the existing landscape of politics, in the sense of like the norms and the expectations of how things work, and how and what you do in a certain situation. Of course, Trump was the biggest norm destroyer. And then by the end of that whole experience, there's not anything really left of like a familiar landmarks where what the political response to this or that is going to be, or how where you can sort of anticipate how an administration is going to go about pursuing their agenda. It's kind of like a free for all right now, and that I think gives Biden a lot of power to shape how things are going to happen over the next few years, because there's a kind of a void of expectations. But I do think that one of the things that I think is at work here in the problems that Republicans have is that you mentioned Corey Robin's thesis about the right being energized by an ascendant left, and from the right point of view, over the last, especially with Trump, for the last 4 years, they have gotten that kind of energy from the perception, or from the depiction of the left as being this cancel culture entity that's trying to evict any kind of conservatism or traditionalism from public life, and that's been the focus of their of the energy they've gotten, in the sense of seeing a threat and responding to the threat. And it was effective for Trump. It got him elected. It got him sort of sustained as something where he had a hardcore fan base. And by getting Trump elected in the White House, it ultimately did allow Republicans to at least get their tax cut. So it sort of kind of worked for all sides, all parties within the Republican side of things in the Republican world. But then there's sort of like a jujitsu thing, that a boomerang that came back on them, which was that the Democrats ended up nominating a guy who is like the least alarming figure from the point of view of somebody who's really afraid of woke culture and cancel culture and all the rest of it, just out of pure affect, and also Biden's record as a moderate. So it's hard so that sort of like kills the energy that they used to get from Obama or from AOC or whatever. And meanwhile, Biden is using that room for maneuver to push through what is in substance actually probably a much more expansive agenda so far than Obama was pushing. But you can't. It's hard to get the Republican base to get excited about that, because they've been completely distracted by this stuff about this culture war stuff. And culture war stuff can work, but it doesn't seem to work with Biden in the White House as the face of the enemy. So that, I think, is another aspect of what's making it hard for them to be an effective opposition.
I want to ask very quickly about the PRO Act. After seeing that clip, I did find it kind of in a way remarkable that Biden came out and mentioned something about the workers in Bessemer, and then said that that we need to pass the PRO Act and that he would sign it if it came across the desk. I find it notable that he did not say that about Medicare for All. If Medicare for All, he said if it came across his desk for whatever reason, he would veto it. What do you make of that? What's driving it, and how transformative would the PRO Act be or not be?
My sense from listening to people who know a lot about labor policy is that the PRO Act would be transformative, or at least it would be the best. It's the best chance of having a transformative change in the labor law environment for unions of anything that we've seen in a long time. It goes further than the Employee Free Choice Act, which was the sort of the last version of labor's wish list. But I mean, this is part of the kind of the choreography of Democratic Party politics generally. I mean, it's still the case that a Democratic presidential candidate, in order to get elected, has to verbally embrace these kinds of core agenda items for the labor movement. But the catch, of course, and I think, in my opinion, one of the reasons why they have no trouble embracing this stuff is that traditionally there has been this thing called filibuster that's there that makes it so that they can credibly turn to the unions and say, well, my hands are tied. I can't pass this because I can't get 10 Republican votes in the Senate or whatever. Joe Biden is a longtime supporter of the filibuster. Obviously, there's a debate right now going on about what the future of the filibuster is going to be. People often talk about the long record of the filibuster's use by segregationists, which is, of course, which is true. It's a big part of the history of the filibuster. But if there's one other policy area that always was one of the bastions of the use of the filibuster, even back in the era when filibusters were pretty uncommon, when they did happen, they happened either over civil rights, or the other one was labor policy. That was the only other thing that was sort of made, I guess, by the norms of politics in the 50s, 60s, 70s, was seen as acceptable for to use a filibuster to block, because for obvious reasons, because both civil rights and labor policy, as you alluded to with the PRO Act in this case, labor policy has the potential to have transformative effects on the structure of power in the country. So that's why the filibuster was always seen, even when the filibuster was seen as something to be used sparingly. Preventing liberal labor reform was considered one of the acceptable areas to use the filibuster. So you can see what the effect that's had on the Democratic Party. Democratic presidents have been able to win election promising that they're going to support up and down, right and left, wall to wall, everything that the unions are asking for when it comes to labor policy, knowing that it is inevitable, that there's no way that those things are going to be able to pass unless the Democrats, on the very rare occasions that they do, have at least 60 votes in the Senate, plus control of the House, plus control of the White House. And the interesting thing is that they actually did manage to get that in Obama's first term, and it was like the dog that caught the bus. They had the 60 votes, and then very quickly, at least one Democrat in the Senate who had promised to support the Employee Free Choice Act had to be the one to come out and say, "Oh, sorry, I'm not going to vote for it." And that was, there were a few who were making noises, but it was Blanche Lincoln in the end from Arkansas who ended up playing that role. And so, that's I think that it's great to talk about the PRO Act and all the good things that it would do, but in my opinion, it's been pretty dead on arrival from the beginning, or even before arrival.
Yeah, you make a really good point about, legislative process and how the filibuster could and very likely will defeat the PRO Act. But related to that, just to kind of connect the dots in regard to labor power and what's different today versus the lead up to the New Deal, I want to share just a quick snippet of a Smithsonian documentary called America in Color, where they talk about the aftermath of the Great Depression and the type of labor activity that took place as people were getting laid off across the country. This specifically has to do with Ford laying off its workers and the reaction and response from those workers. There's a point to this video, which I'll explain once we come back from it, but let's take a quick look.
But by 1932, sales are at rock bottom, and Ford has lost $75 million. He lays off 2/3 of his workforce. In response, the laid-off workers demand that Ford rehire them. On March 7th, 5,000 gather in Detroit and make their way to the Ford plant in Dearborn. The only surviving footage of that fateful day was filmed by the Detroit Unemployed Council. At the city limits, violence erupts. Dearborn police spray tear gas and attack the men with clubs. The protesters fight back with anything they can. Then Ford's private security gets the nod and opens fire. Four laid-off workers died that day. $80,000 mourners join the funeral procession. The relationship between labor and management will remain contentious.
And it certainly did remain contentious. In fact, that type of activity is what pushed Roosevelt to, move toward the Green New Deal, to pass the New Deal, not the Green New Deal. Sorry about that. But, obviously there's a big difference between what we're experiencing today and noticeably conversations about organizing and labor power are kind of missing from the discussion. All of the focus tends to be on electoral politics. And so, I wanted to get your thoughts on that and how we can, even with the tumultuous situation with the legislative filibuster and how it's going to affect the PRO Act, how can we, have discussions about organizing and increasing labor power and using that as more of a tactic to push the White House to get what we want? Because just relying on electoral politics clearly is not enough.
Well, I think that you're right that the kinds of tactic, or the organizing activity in the workplace with the capital labor, duo in that kind of fight has a structural power to it that most other forms of activism rarely achieve, just because of the key position that workers are in when it comes to in the workplace, because that's what it's called, is the workplace, and they do the work. So if they decide that they're not going to do it, then everything grinds to a halt, including the flow of profits to business, and a lot of other things stop as well. So the potential there, of course, is enormous, and I think it's most of the stuff that we would like to see happen, at least the more ambitious parts of it, are not going to happen unless and until there's a lot more activity along the lines of what we saw in that video, which is an amazing footage. I'd never seen that stuff before. But in terms of like how you get to that point, I don't think that there's a magic bullet. This is the kind of thing that organizers, this very small number, but very important number of people who day in and day out think about these issues and act on them in their own workplaces as well as within a larger movement. They have been, they talk about and think about this stuff all the time. You can look at what people around Labor Notes, the organization Labor Notes, which is a sort of a militant, more left-wing organizing tendency within the labor movement. With the stuff that they talk about at their conferences or in their publications, it's really about stuff that's not about mastering knowledge of what's going on in Washington or reading the New York Times every day. It's about talking to your coworkers. It's about like forming relationships with people immediately around you, so that you have a kind of a network of people who can talk about their grievances and develop a sense of self-confidence that they can challenge the boss and do things that are disruptive and do things that are potentially risky, things that you're not supposed to do. That requires building relationships of trust with other people, and that those are conversations and actions that have to go on at the micro scale, within your workplace, or in your neighborhood or wherever. So I don't have a magic bullet solution to that, but I do agree that those kinds of relationships and leading to that potential kind of contestation, that's the sort of thing really almost exclusively that could lead to the really transformative stuff that we're unlikely to see from a Biden administration.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, with this effort to unionize in Bessemer, what really stood out was how Amazon went out of its way to ensure that its fulfillment center workers don't speak to one another. Like they would literally put obstacles in place to prevent them from gathering together, having conversations about the workplace. And so that tells you everything you need to know about what, corporate interests look to do just to further atomize people and prevent any type of collective action. So go ahead, Nando.
No, I mean, I think that's all right. I mean, I think maybe to wrap it up, I wanted to ask about the Biden framing of the infrastructure bill. One of the selling points, one of the marketing points for it is that we need this if we're going to compete with those dastardly Chinese. What did you make of that?
Well, I mean, that's probably an effective line to use on some people, on some senators maybe, and I think senators are probably the main intended audience for that kind of rhetoric. But I mean, not because Biden is uninterested in dealing firmly with the Chinese, but I'm skeptical of the extent to which he actually thinks that the stuff in the infrastructure bill is going to play an important part in that. I mean, they may end up stuffing it full of other things that we haven't heard about that are more geared towards like national security considerations. But it is an indication that of a climate that's developing now. It's familiar from back in the first Cold War days, because back then you also heard that kind of rhetoric from politicians whenever they wanted you to support something that they were peddling. They would say, this is good because it'll help us in the Cold War against the Soviets. And if you're starting to hear that kind of rhetoric about things like the infrastructure bill, and you're hearing it even from Joe Biden and not from, let's say, the most notorious neocon type hawks like Marco Rubio or something, it's an indication of how far along this Cold War mentality has gotten. I mean, what's interesting is that if you look at I mean, this is really a Trump era phenomenon that has become permanent. And when Trump was running for president, the members of the people in the establishment who were horrified by what he was saying and by the prospect of him winning the election would say he's terrible because he's a nationalist who is going to rip up the whole rules-based order that has created this Pacific globalization that we're all benefiting from through his nasty rhetoric about China and his threats of tariffs on China. And then the interesting thing was that as soon as Trump actually started doing that stuff, it turned out that the whole business world and much of the kind of establishment foreign policy world, behind their earlier rhetoric of, we should try to keep China in this, within the tent of the international system, engagement and all the rest of it. But behind that rhetoric, they had, I think, for a long time, been sort of, in a sense, kind of waiting for an opportunity to move towards a Cold War posture. And it was, of all people, Donald Trump, their the guy who they claimed was a disaster who doesn't know anything about foreign policy, who gave them the permission structure to shift to an actual anti-China Cold War type position, which is what happened. So that by the end of the Trump administration, you have Joe Biden and much of both parties using rhetoric that 4 years ago was considered to be the rhetoric of Donald Trump.
Yeah, it is pretty incredible. Absolutely. And those campaign ads, I mean, it didn't matter if it was a Trump campaign ad on China or a Biden campaign ad on China. They were very similar in messaging. So you're right about that. Seth, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone go check out Seth's work. He's the executive editor over at Jacobin. And yeah, we really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Love Seth.
All right.
He's also got a Substack, which, ooh. So yeah, he's got his own Substack. I always appreciate the precision of his analysis and the humility of his analysis in a way. He's very careful and precise and kind of very much can track the contours of the discourse over a slightly longer time frame than most of us who work in the news are, because we're just kind of like, and he said, it's like hard to remember what happened 6 months ago. It really is. So when you have someone who can like remember not just what happened last week or 6 months ago or 2 years ago, 3 years, can track those changes over time, it always I find helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think that's what kind of sets this show and Jacobin programming overall apart from what you're likely to find in even like left news spaces where, where you're constantly chasing what the news of the day is. And when you're doing that, it's really hard to look at history and long-term trends and kind of put everything in context. So I love that about this show, and I love that about the guests we have on. But Nando, we do talk about some of the stories of the day. Before we get to one of my favorite stories that you actually told us about, I just want to encourage everyone who's watching this live to send in your super chat questions. We're going to take a few of them toward the end of the show. Now is the time to start putting your questions in. And Kale, keep track of the super chat questions. No losing them, okay?
No losing.
No losing them.
Especially when they're like, Kale, you put a super chat, $20, $50. He loses it, folks. He loses the super chat. It's very bad, Kale.
Your Trump impression's so good. Anyway, and also you should like and share the stream. It's a really great way of supporting what we do here over at Jacobin. Help us grow the audience, help us spread the message by liking and sharing the stream. But with that said, Nando, why don't we talk a little bit about what Amazon put out? Do you want to take it away? You want to explain it?
Sure. I mean, well, you guys, I'm sure you guys have been following the unionization drive in Bessemer. And in the last week or so, the Amazon PR team has come out in full force. They were finally unleashed. You can tell they were like a caged animal who was just champing at the bit to really stick it to those guys who are doing fake news about Amazon. And one of the tweets that went super viral was a response to Representative Mark Pocan. I don't know how to pronounce his Pocan, whatever. Pocan, who was criticizing Amazon for the fact that many of their workers are forced to pee in water bottles rather than be able to take a bathroom break and go to the bathroom. And Amazon's PR team responded to his tweet saying, "You don't really believe the peeing in bottles thing, do you?" Just like a teenager being obnoxious. And of course, that just prompted hundreds and hundreds of people to come out and say, like, "No, I'm an Amazon worker. I peed in bottles all the time." Ken Klippenstein then published a scoop in which he showed that Amazon's executives knew about the peeing in bottles thing and were also punishing their workers for doing that. So then today, Amazon's PR team released a statement, and it's worth bringing it up. Bring it up, Kale, and we'll read some of it because it's really great. They basically apologized for the peeing in bottles thing. They said that the tweet was ill-conceived, and they called it a, quote, own goal, which I found a very funny term. And they said that if any workers are forced to pee in bottle, that they should go and talk to their manager and that they will fix it immediately.
And let me add to that real quick. Like I love that Ken Klippenstein's reporting has forced Amazon to put out this somewhat of an apology, but not really. Like this is obviously an attempt to clean up their reputation and put out some positive PR. But every time they try to respond to something that they've been accused of, even if they come out with something that's a little more conciliatory or whatever, they still hurt themselves because at the end of the day, their workers are defecating in bags and urinating in bottles because they don't get enough time. Their workload is so overwhelming that they're not able to take enough of a break to use the restroom. But in response to that in response to that statement about going to managers to express things that maybe aren't so comfortable at the workplace, just understand that they've automated their managers. And I didn't even know about this until one of the Bessemer, Alabama warehouse workers spoke to the New York Times. The New York Times has a podcast called The Daily. And when I saw that they had chosen Bessemer, Alabama as one of their topics, I'm like, oh, I'm real curious what they have to say about this. And I listened to it. And one of the employees who, spearheaded this unionization effort said that one of the biggest issues she has is that she can't get a live person when she wants to talk to management, that it's all automated. Which also, I mean, just to tie everything in together, I mean, the untouchable PMC, you're not untouchable, right? I mean, this is just another example of that when they're like literally automating management. And it sucks for the workers because they literally don't have someone to go to complain about these issues. And as we know, by the way, Amazon is full of it. If employees do complain about issues, they end up getting punished for it. Amazon knew that their workers were defecating in bags and urinating in bottles, and their response wasn't to lessen the workload. Their response was to literally punish workers or threaten to punish workers if they continued to do that. So this oh my gosh, we didn't know. Get out of here. It's not
amazing.
working.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, should we take some super chats? Bring young
Yeah,
Kale
let's
in?
do it.
Yeah, we have super chats. So let me, I did
Super
not
chats
lose
are
any
flowing.
of them. Yeah. Let me start with this one. This one's fun. Which miracle is more likely? 1, a Middle Eastern socialist rising from the grave. 2, a giant socialist bunny distributing free candy. Or 3, Biden supporting popular socialist policies that workers want and desperately need. Any takers on 1 or 2?
Probably the bunny. I think we're
bunny.
all going to experience the socialist bunny tomorrow, giving out the free candy.
Yeah. Well, if the Middle Eastern socialists rose from the grave, the CIA would just drone bomb them. So, it wouldn't even matter.
It's true.
Fair. There was a different question I wanted to pull up from Lee, who said that the labor movement is not the current answer. That anti-poverty movements, anti-eviction movements, water protectors movements are available. It's not exactly a question, but...
They're on the menu.
Yeah. Well, I have some thoughts, but I wanted to know if you guys wanted to respond to that.
That's kind of what the... Yeah, go ahead. Anna.
Yeah. No, I mean, the only thing I would say is... the reason why the labor movement is important is because the labor movement helps to actually accomplish all the other things that are listed there, right? Because, again, for me, it's about having an infrastructure in place to accomplish our goals, and we don't have that, right? So right now, all we're doing is relying on electoral politics. And we're relying on social media campaigns to apply pressure to lawmakers who aren't afraid of us because we're not organized. So the only thing I would say is the labor movement in and of itself isn't the goal. It's what follows that to me is important, right? So it's about putting an infrastructure in place to apply pressure effectively to accomplish what we need.
Yeah, the left that Lee describes in that statement, I guess, is very similar to the sort of modern left in Spain, which really came out of the anti-eviction movement, especially a lot of these left-wing mayors, especially Ada Colau in Barcelona, was an anti-eviction activist, and all those efforts are worthy and good, but the labor movement is what gives you staying power, sustainability, and the ability to strike at the heart of the system, which is profit generation. That really is that's really why the labor movement is the most effective tool. Which is not to say that anti-eviction movements aren't good and can achieve kind of short-term victories and things like that, but for long-term systemic change, the labor movement really is the key. It's what really it could achieve changes that last generations, whereas those other movements tend to win victories that are sort of short-term emergency, kind of softening the blow of some awful thing that's about to happen. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with what both of you have said. I want to just to add a little more, because I think the question, part of what she's saying is that it's not which is the most important or which is the most efficable. It's the what is available. And she's saying that the labor movement's not an available option. I would say, my first thought is just that our analysis as people who want to change the world, I think it's important for organizers and activists and people on the left to try to have the most accurate political analysis of the society that we live in, and to, we're not trying to be dogmatic. We are trying to be as scientific as possible. And so I think when we come down and say that the labor movement is what gives working people power, it's not dogmatic. It's not for a moral reason. It is like scientific in a social sense, because we understand, looking at history, that this is the means of getting what we want. And so then we have to extrapolate from the analysis, how do we then apply this to our current moment? So Lee might be right that the labor movement is not, like, a rebuilding of the labor movement is not totally possible right now. I don't think that's necessarily true. I disagree. And I think that, as Seth mentioned, we're in a somewhat dynamic moment that it's hard to tell where the trajectory of things in politics and in the economy broadly are moving right now. But I also, I want to second what Nando and Anna have said, that the other alternatives that Lee laid out are really, to be effective, they have to be understood as a part of a broader anti-capitalist thrust, that we do want to re-enable and rebuild the labor movement for what we've said, for the reasons that we've said. And so maybe these other means are something that can get us to that point, or maybe not. But that's how we should be thinking, that, as Anna said, there are principles and there are goals that we have in mind, and then we find the correct means to get there. And just what we've learned from history is that the labor movement is the most effective means to advance working people's power and interests. So until there's a better option, that's what we're stuck with.
It's science, left. Folks. Fucking Bill Nye the Science
Guy. We believe in
science.
we believe in science on Jacobin. There's another question from Erica, who very generously sends us a super chat and says, Amazon has apologized for trolling. Do you think their tweets were good for the unionizing efforts in Alabama, or were they neutral or even bad?
They were good.
Definitely. I agree. Yeah, I agree.
They were definitely good. They made him look scared, which is always good. You always want, facing a confident enemy that is powerful and confident is always much harder. Facing a powerful enemy that seems rattled, makes it a little easier.
And I think what happened was, like what we talked about today, like the end result of the Amazon trolling was an admission that their employees are reduced to awful things, like not being able to use a restroom. I think that it ended up exposing Amazon to people who maybe didn't know the extent to which employees are abused there. And that's, it's a good thing that people are more aware of that. And it's a good thing that in the end, it was Amazon that had to respond to Ken Klippenstein's reporting about what the reality is. So I do see it as a positive. And I think that one of the best parts of this union drive is how it's inspired other workers across the country to start having these conversations. So this is huge. And, I talked about that episode of The Daily, which is the New York Times podcast. The employee that they spoke to from Bessemer said something that stayed with me. She's like, look, obviously we want them to win. We want them to unionize. But she was asked if it doesn't work, what are your thoughts? And she's like, I think we've already won because of what's happening across the country. And I think that's important to keep in mind. People are waking up to this.
Not just that, but the people in these campaigns over and over again talk about the experience itself is transformative for people. It's doing politics. It's attaching yourself to a struggle that has been going on for centuries. It makes you feel like you're part of something worthwhile, that you're not just at home watching Netflix all day and feeling guilty about it, that you're part of some grand struggle that is bigger than yourself. And that is a transformative experience for many people. I mean, it's just that's what it's about. That's what life's about. It gives you purpose. It gives you meaning, and it changes your politics forever. Like it really does. So I can see how this time and like the last couple of months for these people in Bessemer, Alabama, in which they've really put Bessemer on the map, through their courage. I mean, no one had heard of Bessemer before. No one in the country ever thought about Bessemer for half a second ever. And now they are at the center of probably the political struggle of the last, I don't know, it's a long time. And that experience must be transformative and must feel incredible for the people on the ground.
Yeah.
I think that's totally right. And I would only add that we have to remember that, any good general in a war would tell you that you're not going to win every battle, that and that's not to be pessimistic, that I hope for the best I hope for good election results that comes out of Bessemer in the near future. And it's been incredible to see the amount of energy there's been to attempt to unionize in other plants as well across the country. And so that's ultimately what's going to mean true success, that we want the workers in Bessemer to get the union, but for them to succeed beyond that, and for working people in America broadly to succeed beyond that, it's going to take increasing wins in unionization efforts in Amazon. And part of that's just because of the size of them, that they have so many different plants. And so the reality is that
they're fulfillment centers, Kale. They don't make anything.
I just mean, like, in the crudest sense, it's just like a block of capital. It's just like a bunch of money that they have invested into a space in the world. And so yes, it's a fulfillment center, but like they have so many of these across the country and across the world that we should be supportive of every single one of these efforts, and also understand the long game, that this is, whether or not we win or lose this fight is not the end of this story, that we need to continue to push for this, that Amazon is going to be maybe it's already one of history's greatest, biggest villains that we're going to have to try to tackle and take on. And so it's just, I guess the point is just we have to keep the long game in mind. But I agree that what has transpired over the last week with the social media has definitely probably been a big morale boost.
You just reminded me of something that I wanted to quickly mention in response to that earlier question about, labor shouldn't be the immediate goal. Look, when it comes to anti-poverty measures, when it comes to something like increasing the federal minimum wage, when you look to countries, and Nando and I talked about this, I think it was on the Young Turks, but when you look at Scandinavian countries, they don't have a mandated minimum wage because they have unions there, and the unions negotiate the wages on behalf of the workers. And so if you just do a comparative analysis, clearly they're doing much better in Denmark, for instance, than what we're experiencing in the United States, while just sitting back and relying on electoral politics to do the work for us. Clearly, it hasn't worked out. We haven't increased the federal minimum wage since 2009. So I think that's a pretty good example of what we're trying to communicate in what can be accomplished through organized labor.
Right. I would just add, I think that's right. And there's a good, there's an author named Matt Dimmock who's written both in Catalyst and Jacobin on this question of why do labor movements look different in different parts of the world, and to what extent has labor law been a part of that? And like Anna said, they don't have a minimum wage in the Nordic countries. And conservatives love to walk that little bit of information out. But of course, it's been that they have both, they've had a history of militant union organizing and action. They've had a powerful social democratic party. And some of it is also just kind of regionally, historically contingent. But I think studying the Nordic countries is probably one of the things that the left has to spend more time doing in the near future to try to understand how did they win those fights, and to what extent.
You can read it in Socialist Manifesto by one Bhaskar Sunkara. Thank you, comrade, Vice Premier Bhaskar.
Lee wanted to follow up, and I'm just going to pull up her super chat that of course we need a vibrant labor movement. It's critical for systemic change to look at pre-New Deal actions were not labor. Other actions were the Veterans March for pensions, creating the tent city, and Jay McAlevey has spoken on this. Right, I think that's true.
False dichotomy. There were plenty of labor actions, and Eugene Debs existed in the second half of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, hyper focused on labor militancy. The populist movement was essentially a labor movement of farmers. So all those things laid the groundworks for the labor action that then led to the New Deal in the 1930s. The Veterans March was important, and it did very much shock the nation, but there was no absence of labor action before then. It was definitely available, so to speak.
Right, and again, it's just insofar as it's efforts that are contributing to building working class power. I mean, that's the ultimate goal, right? So again, the labor movement is a means to that ends, just as much as what Nando's just laid out. That's where we have to strategically be oriented. Okay, this is a long-time listener and first-time caller from Benjamin Burgess asking me what are my plans for Wednesday, because he heard that Jacobin show is taking a little break this week. And for all of you guys who don't know, this Wednesday is actually Ben's birthday. And so we're doing a...
Happy birthday!
Yeah, well, I'll say it to you a little bit later, but happy birthday, Ben. But a part of his show, he does a movie series on Wednesday nights. Unfortunately, our shows kind of butt up against each other a little bit, but and so myself and others are going to be doing a high-level dissection of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. So if you like The Shining...
Kale pretends to know about movies. He gave me shit about you haven't watched the original Godzilla in the original Japanese. If you haven't watched the Japanese, you don't really know what Godzilla is about.
You guys are crazy.
You can't watch Godzilla versus Kong.
So there's another super chat that I want to pull up from Matthew, who asks, what are the options if they try to shut down the Bessemer facility? Has Biden appointed anyone?
The only option they have is to watch the original Godzilla in Japanese, and yeah, that's how they're gonna win.
I think that's among the possibilities. I mean, I don't know. I think it's tough. I mean, I think what are the options? I mean, labor's at a structural disadvantage in these fights, so I think they could do that, and there's a decently high percentage chance that they will. So I think what we do is we understand this fight as something much larger and longer, and that it's not just a fight in Bessemer, and so that we are in solidarity with these workers in a much bigger fight. That we're not, to the extent that we can, in fact, engage in this, we can't relegate ourselves to just being viewers of something else going on, that we have to understand ourselves as a part of it and try to figure out how do we continue this fight into the future.
Yeah. I wanted to add one thing to the Ben super chat, because Nando was on Ben's show. Was it last week or the week before? It was really good. So you guys should check that out. It was this week.
It was on Wednesday.
You guys should check that out.
Yeah.
I was watching live while cooking, got to support the homies, and it was a great episode. So everyone should check that out as well.
Thank you.
We love Ben Burgess.
That's it.
Enjoy his work. That's all we got, folks. I'm going to peace out. But thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching. Hit like, hit subscribe, share us with your friends. If they don't know about us, why don't they? That's on you now. So
that's on you.
It's on you.
You have to do it. You got to do it. You got to share us.
Thanks, Kale. And thank you to everyone who's watching. And I don't really have much to add to what Kale said. Thank you for your support. Sharing and liking this video will certainly help to get the message out there. But make sure you're subscribed not only to this channel, but that you have a subscription to Jacobin's magazine. It's fantastic. Don't just settle for the digital version. You want to get that hard copy. Okay.
They're beautiful. They're beautiful. They really are.
They really are.
Each individual magazine is kind of like a work of art. Like, they'll be read by leftists hundreds of years from now because each one is just so special.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for watching, guys. Happy Easter and enjoy the rest of your weekends. We'll see you next weekend with another episode of Weekends. See you guys.